All right, PMs. I've got Saeed Khan with me in the podcast today. And Saeed had a post on LinkedIn, which is becoming like the Facebook for work stuff now. And he said, hey, been doing a lot of work on road mapping and the implications and different interpretations and best practices. And given for many of us, this is like annual planning time, and we're all being asked to provide or review or weigh in on roadmaps. And I thought it would be great to have you in the show. So welcome to the Fireside PM Pod, Saeed.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Tom. It's good to be here.
So why don't we start with a little background about you, and then we'll get into the road mapping stuff. But tell us a little bit about your career and your work in product management.
Sure. I'll try and make it brief. So I've been in product management officially for about 25 years. Started back in '97 at a software company here in Toronto. Moved to the U.S. in about 2000. Literally at the height of the .com bubble. I think it was March of 2000.
Oh wow!
So yeah, it was a rough couple of years, and then things stabilized. But it was a great experience. I spent 6 years there. Worked at a couple of startups, and then at a small public company. Came back to Canada in 2006. Worked in some more software companies. Then went back to work for the company. It was companies called Informatica. Went and worked there for quite a few years, but based in Canada. And then about 5 years ago, left and started doing consulting. And so essentially, I mean, all that time from '97 was in product. I mean, there was kind of a minor break. I spent a little bit of time in marketing, a little bit of time in sales, sort of technical sales, but pretty much, and when I say a little bit, it's like 6 months. So very short. And so I've been doing consulting for the last 5 years, working with technology companies primarily, and then a few kind of larger companies, but they're sort of IT organizations, and helping them understand product, get better at product, create successful products, and really put a lot of that knowledge I gained over about 20 years working inside of companies into play. I talk about helping companies build better products, but also better product organizations. And what that really means is I do a lot of mentoring, workshops, and then hands-on work to help them improve how they function in a product sense. And then, the goal is to enable them to be better at product in general.
Did you find your time outside of product in marketing and technical sales, has that changed did that change anything in terms of how you thought about product management after, or curious about what that experience was like, kind of trying out or working in different functions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I would say yes. It's one thing to work with sales, let's say. It's another thing to be in sales, right? I think the biggest thing, and the same in marketing as well, same in any group, I think the biggest thing is the context switch is significant, and not knowing, let's say when you're outside of product management, not knowing the things you used to know and seeing seeing the dysfunction from another perspective. I think it's difficult. Like it's like saying, "Hey, I know what this is like, and now I'm on another sort of in another group, and now I wish I knew what was going on over there." Right. So not having clarity on what product management is really doing, not having clarity on, what the details are going to be, having to wait to learn about what's coming out. Right. Like there's a whole bunch of things that happen in product management that unfortunately are not communicated well, and other groups, suffer from it. So I think seeing it from the other side and knowing that it could be better was eye-opening. And then it also changes the way you work in general. I mean, obviously in marketing, you're doing things that are part of your job. And if you don't have the information, then you do what you can. You make decisions. You move forward. And I think those are things that I think product managers and product management organizations need to understand, is that they have to see themselves as a real center for organizational alignment, and
Mm-hmm.
they're not a silo. They're not, we do this, you guys do that. You can't think of it that way. So I think that seeing it from the other side, just, I mean, I think I was sensitive to it, but I think being on the other side and being explicitly aware of the gaps and the issues with communication were a bit eye opening. In one company, I moved from product management into sort of the technical sales side, and so I could reach into the org and pull what I needed, but not everyone can do that, right?
Was there a moment where when you were in sales and marketing and you had to work with product managers that you were like, oh, this is a perspective that I'm going to take with me, and in the future when I'm back in product, that I'm going to try and adjust based on this kind of firsthand experience?
Um, yeah, yes and no. So I think I'll just say this: I worked in product management for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was started in '97 in product management formally, and I didn't realize it back then, but the company I worked at in '97 was, I think, an exceptionally well-run small company. And when I say small, it's about 100 people. Um, and it was very collaborative, and there was good cross-functional communication. It wasn't perfect, but it was good.
Mm-hmm.
And so from my very first job, uh, I was exposed to that, and and in a way, it just, it's like when you only have one experience, you think, oh, this is the way it is. That's the way it is everywhere. That's the way it should be. You kind of assume
Right.
that, and so you bring that forward with you. And I think that because of that first job, I've always, excuse me, I've always had that sort of mindset that our job is truly cross-functional, and
Mm.
we need to work closely with these other groups. Um, I think it was just, in those other roles, not being in product, I think it just reminded me, let's say that, of the importance of that work. And so, you feel the pain, as opposed to having empathy for others, you actually felt the pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it just kind of, oh yeah, I really need to make sure that I don't forget these things. So um, I think, had I not worked in that company as my first product management job, yeah, absolutely, I would have. Probably would have been eye opening to me to see it from the other side, and understand exactly what's going on.
And when you were in these other roles, I'm guessing in sales and marketing, you want to have visibility into the product roadmap, or maybe input, and want to be part of that process. What was the road mapping kind of experience like from the other side?
Oh, it was terrible.
Tell me more.
Well, I mean, you know, well, again, there were short stints, right? So one was, I
Mm-hmm.
think, 8 months, and one was about 4 or 5 months, right? So they were very short. So it wasn't as if uh, I had a lot of pain in those short period of times from that perspective. But I think I just did a lot more asking for information than I would have liked. And the other side of it is that, there's a mind shift that has to happen. And I think I was still kind of working in that product centric mindset, right? As opposed to making that shift to marketing and really having the marketing hat on, or having the sales hat on. Um, and had I been in those roles longer, I probably would have made that shift, and adjusted. Someone said to me, because I left and I came back to product, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you can take the man out of product, but you can't take the product out of the man. It's like, yeah, that's true. You know, I think that's where I belong. So yeah.
Yeah. Now, lately, you've been doing some more work on roadmaps and doing some workshops and stuff. Tell us a little bit more about how you think about product roadmaps and what you see PM struggle with when it comes to them.
Yeah, so so a lot of the work I do with clients is tied to product planning and product roadmaps and discovery, and sort of that before you build whatever work, and it's really important. And what I've seen is most companies can build. I mean, you know, it's not a missing skill, right?
Hmm.
But it's what they build that's really where the problem is. Are they building the right things? Are they understanding their markets? Are they, focusing on what's important? Um, and so you hear people talk, and I've done this too. I mean, I'm not immune to it, but people talk about the roadmap, right?
Hmm.
And and the roadmap is this word that just gets abused beyond belief. The roadmap, in most cases, the roadmap is just whatever they're going to build, right? We'll put it on the roadmap. Oh, it's on the roadmap. Well, we'll
Hmm.
consider it for the roadmap, right? And the challenge I found is that and when they do that, like the roadmap and the plan are blended together, right? It's the road plan or the plan map or whatever you want to call it. You end up in this sort of feature factory world where you're just
Mm.
building, right?
Right.
And the reality is, oh yeah, you got the diagram up. That's great. The reality is that a roadmap actually is something that's really important. It's an artifact that comes out of a road mapping process, right? So we talk a lot more about roadmaps than we talk about road mapping.
Mm.
But that road mapping process is really a process of identifying what's important and then to achieve your goals, and then structuring it in a way that makes sense. So it's not everything you're going to build, right? But it's an articulation of strategy that is really focused on the most important things you need to do in order to achieve objectives. And then on top of that, right, in addition to that, there's a bunch of tactical work that needs to be done, right? And so what you build, quote quote, is a combination of things that support your roadmap, which means supporting your strategy and objectives, and things that are tactical that for various reasons have to be done. And the blend of them goes into a plan that you put together and you deliver on. And the reason that it's important is that you want to have clear focus on those important things, and you don't want to lose sight of it, right? So you want to keep this roadmap as an artifact of the road mapping process, and you want it to really be distinct. And so when new requests come in from sales or something comes up, you're not just taking this big ball of stuff, your plan map or whatever,
Hmm.
and going, okay, what should we add or what should we subtract? It's You're actually making a decision based on important items, right? So if we have to change our roadmap, right, and I'm saying the actual roadmap, not the plan, right? If we have to
Hmm.
defer something, we have to consider in the context of the strategy and the objectives that drove it. And if this new thing doesn't outweigh those strategy objectives, then we don't do it, or we defer some tactical thing, right? Like the connection between what's on your roadmap and what's tied to strategy and objectives has to be consistent, because otherwise you're just going to meander. And that's what happens in a lot of companies, right? Like a deal comes in, oh, we got this deal, oh, but it needs this extra thing that we weren't planning on doing. And it's like, well, yeah, we weren't planning on doing it because it doesn't apply to anything we want to do. Oh, but it's a big deal. Right?
Hmm.
And so what's important there? Is the revenue important there? Is the thing you have to deliver on important? Right? Like what's the opportunity cost of doing that and not doing this other important stuff that you decided was tied to your objective? So it's kind of a holistic way of looking at it. And you want to keep those things separate so that you don't just bump really important stuff because a deal or some, partnership or something came in. So I think that's really where, when I talk about roadmaps, I really want people to understand is that the word has a meaning. It's important. You shouldn't just blur the meaning with your delivery plan, and you should use it as a tool to create alignment and focus on what's really important to creating goals. And I think, quite honestly, companies that do that, and some of them do it explicitly and some of them do it, kind of implicitly, but companies that do that end up being better off than companies that don't, because you can build, and there's nothing wrong with building, but are you building the right things? Are you building things that keep you focused on your longer term goals, right? And if your
Mm-hmm.
longer term goals are just revenue, great, like do whatever. But if you have something a little more higher level that you're focusing on, then you have to do a little bit of work to kind of keep that focus.
And if we talk about the execution of road mapping,
Yes.
do you see PMs? Actually, someone asked me this a few weeks ago about road mapping tools, and I come from my history is like, oh well, we just throw it in a slide, or we it starts off, in some shared spreadsheet, and then we kind of like reformat it and put it in a slide,
Yeah.
reading left to right kind of thing. I'm curious, have you seen interesting or good tools out there to help people do the actual process of road mapping better, or is it, you know, kind of
Um,
old school?
no, let's talk about the process of road mapping first, and then we can get into
Hmm.
tools, right? So the process of road mapping, from my view, and you had that slide up, and in the
Hmm.
top right there was this little stack that may have been hard to read, but it has vision, objective, strategy, roadmap, and plans, right? That's kind of the stack.
Hmm.
And so the process of road mapping really is a process of aligning strategic goals and defining those strategies that will have a component that you know has to be executed on, right? So the word roadmap itself, right, if we just put everything else aside, right, you can think of a roadmap as an articulation of strategy. It's something that you're going to, it's maybe a set of activities that derive from those strategies that you need to execute on, and those strategies are defined as bets you're going to make. Like, these are the big bets you're going to make to achieve objectives, right? So
Hmm.
we want to grow 50% next year. Let's just throw that out as a number. Well, you're not going to grow 50% by just doing whatever you did last year. Like, maybe you can grow 10% by just doing more of the same, but how are you going to close that gap, right? That 40% gap. And so you're going to have to come up with ways based on the market and competition and your own abilities to execute, and say, okay, this is how we're going to get that additional 40%. So right away, it's important stuff. It's tied to a really big objective.
Hmm.
Now, now, an example I'll use is, let's say part of your growth is you want to enter a new market. So we're not selling much in Europe. Let's say we really want to sell into like Germany and France, for example, um, and so we're going to use that as a growth vehicle. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, you're going to have to get some salespeople in Germany and France, right? You might have to create some support process for that part of the world. Different hours. You're probably going to have to localize your product. You might have to actually add some functionality to the product to support local needs, whatever your product does, etc. So there's a bunch of stuff, right? There's like go to market stuff, there's product stuff, there's organizational stuff. All of that is really important because it's to tie into your goals. Well, the product stuff is going to go into your product roadmap. And so you have to understand all of that process first. And then you can think about tools, in my opinion, right? Because if you're not clear on what road mapping is, then having tools isn't going to solve your first problem, right? So I
Hmm.
think that's what people need to think about first is, do we have a well-defined and beneficial road mapping process, right? Do we understand how to bring all that together? And as an organization, do we agree that this is how we want to work. Because a lot of organizations, you can bring a tool, but it doesn't mean the organization is going to change the way they work. So let's get the internal process right, and then let's look at how we do road mapping, and what tools might support that process. And I think that's the better way of going about it, right? The tools support what you need to achieve and do, as opposed to bending to the tool because you decided on a tool. So I think that's the way I look at it. Now, there are lots of tools now. There, 10 years ago there weren't. Now there's a whole bunch of tools out there to do road mapping. I've looked at a couple of them. I'll be honest with you. I have not used them in detail. I actually have a road mapping tool that I've created that I use with my clients. And it's not a commercial product that is meant to compete with, AHA and those kinds of things. But it's a fairly simple tool that walks people through thinking about strategy, thinking about the outputs of those strategies. We create what's called a business roadmap, first of all, that actually, kind of organizes those go-to-market, organizational, product activities. And then the product stuff goes into a product roadmap along with some other inputs and gets refined even further. And so what you end up with is, at least the goal in my view, is alignment between what the business is trying to achieve and what the product organization is going to do to support that, right? And then, of course, the product organization will do other things as well. But you want that alignment, you want that connection between the product and the business, and then you can sort of execute on that in a sort of, I guess, aligned way is the way I would think about it, right? Like, we're doing this over here in product, you guys are doing this in marketing, they're doing this in sales. The combination of all those things is contributing to achieving the goals that we've all agreed to.
One of the things you referenced, Saeed, is this notion of sometimes like the company lands a big deal or a big partnership, or sales has a particular point of view, or maybe marketing has a particular point of view. And, there are different stakeholders around what should be on the roadmap.
Yeah.
And, I think in a lot of consumer kind of established tech companies, the PM has a lot of influence, and it's like, well, this is the roadmap. But, in more enterprise or other types of environments, there's more of a tension sometimes, or different perspectives between different parts of the organization. I'm curious what advice would you have for PMs that are trying to close out their 2023 roadmap, and they're getting all of these kind of inputs that, from a variety of places, and you just can't do it all next year?
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm glad you have the diagram up, and let me reference that, because I think it'll help answer the question. So first of all, road mapping is not a solitary activity. I always say road mapping is a team sport, right? Road mapping is this process I just described, right? It's like you're looking at the high level objectives. So first of all, align on objectives. Like, before you talk about roadmap, align on objectives, right? Get the objectives clear. What do we want to achieve, let's say, next year, right? The kind of growth or acquisition or retention or profitability or revenue or, whatever. Like, you're going to have some objectives, and they're going to be business objectives. Because I always say, if you can align on objectives, right, then you can debate, sort of the process, right? Like, if we all agree that, let's say I'm with a group of friends and we all agree we want to go out for dinner, let's at least agree on the kind of food we want, right? Like, hey, are we up for seafood, or are we up for Mexican, or are we up for Japanese, or whatever? Like, let's at least agree on that, as opposed to going, okay, what does everyone want to eat? Right? Because you're not going to get very far with that approach. So align on objectives and have that clarity. And that clarity has to come almost always from above, right? Your executive teams have to have that clarity, and they have to tell you, like, these are our goals for next year. And then they'll break out, right, into sort of sub goals. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, you've got 2 product lines, and the goal is to grow 40% or 50% next year. Well, one of those products might be a higher growth product than the other, right? Like, let's just say it's newer and it's growing faster, and so it's going to contribute more. And the other one is maybe an older product that isn't, going to grow as much, but it will contribute. So like break that out into something that's meaningful at that product level or product line level. And in most companies I've worked in, we've had something at least at that level. Like, your goal for your product this year is this, right? Our overall goals are Y, and these are the individual product goals. Okay, great. Now we can work with something as a product manager. So start there, and then go and get this other input, right? Like, people want to be heard. It doesn't mean that you have to listen and do what everyone says, right? But you want to hear these other groups' input, and you want to understand their challenges and their objectives, so you can balance out what's going to happen. Because that process I just talked about earlier about going from objectives to a business roadmap to a product roadmap, that process I found really helps drive alignment, and you're listening. Like, you're not just coming up with something bottom up. It's actually being driven a bit top down, but also horizontally. And people will buy into it. Like, oh yeah, if sales is saying, hey, we're on the hook for that revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where the growth is going to come from. We're on the hook for it. Well, these are the ways we think we're going to achieve it. How can you support us, or what are the things you're going to do to contribute to that, right? So you get this alignment that doesn't happen if you don't do it collaboratively, and if you do it bottom up. So I think that process has to be explicit. People have to understand it, and then you kind of formulate this picture. And again, this is where I think that phrase, you don't just put stuff on the roadmap. Like, if your roadmap is just a bunch of stuff, everyone's going to question, well, why? Why is that there? Why did you decide on that? Where did that come from? If your roadmap is the output of a road mapping process, then you can look at the whole process, and you can tie back what's being done with the objectives and the strategies that are being defined. And all of a sudden, the discussion is not about the roadmap. The discussion is about the right way to achieve those objectives. And that's a much healthier and a much more productive discussion, right? And that's what the product managers should be facilitating. So I think that's a real key distinction people need to understand, right? Like, it's not like roadmaps are important because you're going to execute on that and you're going to use that, etc. But the road mapping process is even more important, because that's where the alignment and the elaboration comes in.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that in my experience as well. Like, I think a lot of PMs, we can get a little worked up about roadmaps and PRDs, because these are like big artifacts for PMs. But if you can agree on the objectives, or I would say my favorite topic is like success measurements and success metrics, because if you can agree on those things, then a lot of the road mapping debates kind of are much faster to navigate, because it's like, well, we agreed it was 2023 revenue. So it's not, innovation for its own sake, or it's not, increasing velocity or stability or whatever. It's all about landing more revenue. So if that's the case, we have a question in the live chat from Justin. To what extent does the state of a product affect your approach to road mapping? For example, pre-product market fit product versus established post-market fit companies.
Okay, good question, actually. So I think the general process, I would say, is the same, right? In terms of collaborative understanding, objectives, and really trying to align what you're doing with overall objectives. I think in that pre-product market fit, and I have a bit of a issue with the term product market fit as well, but let's just say, you're still working out a lot of the, let's say the use cases and the specific focus of where the product will be. I think in those earlier stages, there's just a lot more uncertainty and a lot more ambiguity. But then that should align, like your goals should align with that, right? So like if you have a product that, again, pre-product market fit, meaning that you haven't really nailed the use cases and you're still looking for some repeatable revenue sort of patterns, then your goals should be aligned with that, meaning that it shouldn't be, oh, we're going to grow 50% this year, or we're going to have these very mature objectives. No, your objectives should be tied to some form of customer acquisition or some form of targeted growth or something else, right? Like, you can't just kind of divorce the two. So I think once you have those objectives and they make sense, then the process you'd follow is similar, but you just have to realize there's a lot more ambiguity and uncertainty in that earlier stage, right? In the later stage, you've got a really good understanding of your use cases, who is your buyers are, and so you can be a little more objective in terms of, and maybe objective isn't the right word, and some people might not like this word, but you can be a little more prescriptive in terms of what you plan to do, right? There's still uncertainty there, but it's not the kind of uncertainty prior to that. So I think that's the way I would answer it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And my sense is that, the earlier stage projects or companies, the roadmaps will be a little more coarse grained, and you don't have to lay out like exactly what the world's going to look like 2-3 years from now, because you're still figuring stuff out.
Yes.
Whereas, if it's a more established product, then it's you could probably get a little more detailed and perhaps project a little further out. But ultimately, the foundational process of agreeing on objectives and the strategy should drive it.
And I think you make a good point on the time frame, and I think this is another one that people sometimes get caught up on, right? Like, there's a certain faction, the no roadmaps faction, because you can't predict the future and so on. And no one can predict the future, and that's not the point of a roadmap or even a plan, right? Like, you just think in the real world, like, hey, I'm going to go meet someone somewhere, and we're going to meet at a certain time and at a certain place. And is that certain? No, absolutely not, right? Like, you could get into traffic jam or something and you're late, right? Like, I plan to fly somewhere. Oh, guess what? Like, the flight got canceled, right? So there's no certainty in anything. The point of those roadmaps and is to really sort of help guide some of the decision making you have, and to say, okay, in the future, these are the things that are important that we want to execute on. In an earlier stage company, that future, because it's much more uncertain, you can only look a shorter term ahead, right? Like, it might only be 6 months, right? Because there's so much uncertainty in what you're doing. In a more established company, you might be looking at a year or 2 years ahead or whatever, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, the objectives are what's really important, and the objectives have to incorporate that reality, right?
Yeah. Well, it's been great to have you on the podcast, Saeed, to talk about road mapping. Are there other points that you wanted to make that we haven't touched on yet?
First of all, I can't believe our time is up. I was just getting into it. So I think this idea of road mapping really needs to be understood as strategic road mapping. Like, every time you say the word roadmap, just put the word strategic in front of it, right? Because roadmaps are about strategy. They're not about execution at the bottom level. And make a distinction between roadmaps and plans, right? So, like, to summarize, one of the things I've been really trying to get crisp and articulate what a roadmap is versus what a plan is, and really hone in and why they're different and why you need to think of them differently. So the way I articulate it is that a roadmap is a statement of direction and priority.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A plan is a statement of execution and delivery. And those two statements, I think, are at least in my perspective, are very clear in terms of how they're different. right? Plans and roadmaps are related, and that diagram kind of tried to articulate that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but execution delivery is not a roadmap, right? And in direction and priority is not a plan, right? So I think if people kind of keep those two statements in mind and sort of understand what those mean, I think it'll help them.
Absolutely. And how can people sort of continue to stay connected with you? What are you working on that people should know about?
Wow. So if they want to stay connected with me, LinkedIn is the easiest way. I tend to be, on LinkedIn fairly often. I don't remember my LinkedIn. It's like /in/Saeed Khan, I think, but I don't know if you can put in the show notes.
Yes, it is in/Saeed W Khan.
Saeed W Khan. Thank you. I write on Medium. It's probably, when I blog, it's on there. It's swkhan.medium.com. And I'm working on some software. And so I mentioned this tool, road mapping tool. So since the pandemic came, a lot of the work I did, obviously, well, in fact, all the work, like everyone else, went virtual. A lot of the exercises that I would do with clients had to go online.
Mm-hmm.
And I've taken most of that and created some online tools that I use with clients. And I'm probably in the next 6 months, I'm going to start opening that up to non-clients. So, tools related to road mapping, discovery, sort of user research. Those are sort of the things that I'm working on and people might see and hear about in the near future.
Awesome. Before we let you go, I know we spend most of our time talking about road mapping, but in terms of advice that you would give to PMs or that you find you often give to PMs, what would be some things that you'd want to share with the audience out there just to help product managers, learn from your experience?
So I'll say two things. So one of them, first of all, I want to give a message out to product leaders. And I think a lot of focus gets put on product managers in terms of what should product managers do and how can product managers be more successful. I think one of the things that can really help product managers is really good supportive product leaders who understand the work that needs to be done, can support, mentor, and coach the product managers, right? Because most product managers have no formal training. They're learning on the job. They might have had previous jobs, but those jobs themselves were, also rather ad hoc in many ways. And really provide them with clarity and clear objectives, right? Like, so I think we talked a lot about business objectives and product objectives, but I think product leaders should really work with product managers to define clear objectives. Like, what does success for an individual product manager look like, right? Forget about product success. What does product manager success look like? And really be explicit about that, understand that, articulate that, and then support that, right? I think a lot of product managers struggle and they don't have the success from their leadership that's needed. So I'll make that kind of one piece of advice. And then I think for product managers, individual product managers, and it's kind of it's a hard thing in some ways for me because I remember those early days, back in '97 when I first became a product manager. But I'm a bit distant from it. But this idea of imposter syndrome comes up a lot. Am I really, do I really belong here? There's a lot of pressure on product managers to do things that may be outside their comfort zone. And I think the thing I would say is, get assistance, right? Get the support you need. And when if you're overwhelmed, like, you should be able to work in an environment where you can speak out, right, to your managers or to whoever, say, look, I need help, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I did that. I remember one example when I did that, where I went to my my manager. This is when I worked in California, and I just said, "Hey, I can't do all this." Like, it was a huge product. I was a single product manager, and there was just so much going on. And to his credit, he said, "Okay, so what are the most important things that you think you should be working on?" And I told him, and there were three things. And he said, "Okay, you focus on those three things, and I'll help manage the rest." And he ran, like, interference for me in a sense of like, hey, if someone said Saeed isn't doing this, he would say, yeah, because I told Saeed to do that, right? And I think that kind of environment is really important. I think it's good for the product managers themselves, but it's also good for the product. Like, I could focus on the important things and not be distracted by lots of, unimportant things. And I think product managers should be, sort of aware of that and speak out and say, these are the things that need focus, and how can I focus on them? So I think the two are related.
Yeah.
But I think you have to have that, right? And if you don't have that, then there's a whole other discussion we can have on what to do.
Yeah, it's such a tough job as a PM, in that a lot of people love the profession because you get to work on so many different things that relate to the success of the product. But that also means a lot of stuff collects on your plate,
Yeah,
and you're kind of like the safety net, and like, whoa, I guess let's ask the PM. And so that list grows pretty long.
yeah,
And totally agree with you on the importance of prioritization and working with the product leadership, and then also product leadership working with the PMs on the ground to make sure that people are set up for success.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, like, yeah, prioritization, absolutely. And I think that also really having that, like, the word psychological safety comes a lot, but just really having that culture of allowing people to focus, right? I think if there's one thing that product managers will say to you, is that they're pulled in so many directions that they can't focus, and
Hmm.
it becomes hard. They have responsibilities cross functionally. They have their own jobs. They're doing, traveling, etc. Whatever, and so people, I found, I mean, I'll just speak for myself, but I found the best work I've ever done was when I had time to focus. And so really enable that in product teams, and build out product teams that can focus, right? That have clarity on the work they're doing, right? Removing that ambiguity, removing that uncertainty, I think is a huge thing that product leaders can do to benefit not just their own product managers, but the teams and the company in general.
I think that's a great note to end on, Saeed. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your Sunday morning with us. Really appreciate you taking the time, and folks should check out your prolific poster on LinkedIn. So Saeed W. Khan is the handle on LinkedIn, and then hopefully we'll have another conversation with you in the future, because it feels like we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, the time flew by. So I'd love to do this again.
Love it. Thanks, Saeed. Take care, buddy.
Thanks.
Bye. All right. That was fun, especially given that it's end of the year and all of us are doing annual planning and being asked to produce or update or adjust roadmaps. Um, Maybe I'll give you some closing thoughts. First, before I forget, if you're finding this content useful, please do me a solid, and Saeed, do him a solid by liking and sharing. Um, this is a very niche kind of podcast. So thanks in advance. Second thing is, I would love to know in the comments, uh, put them down in the comments below, like what's advice you wish you had heard you could give yourself like 5 years ago, if you've been in product for a while, about great roadmaps. Or if you're earlier in your product career around road mapping, like what's the question that you wish some experienced PMs could answer? And hopefully you'll get those answers in the comments on replay. My thoughts on road mapping is it creates a lot of anxiety for people because we all know there's strong disagreement, and then the whole like x-axis is debated because you've got to obviously work with engineering to figure out what can be done, and then the actual boxes are debatable because everybody has an opinion. I want to underscore something that Saeed and I talked about. He talked about it as agreeing on objectives, and I would extrapolate that even further and say agree on success metrics for the organization. Um, and that's a hard one. I've been on projects where it took like 2 quarters to finalize what is the single success metric we're going to use to measure success for this organization. And there was a ton of debate and back and forth and pressure testing. And so, yes, roadmaps are important. Yes, PRDs are important. They're crucial. But having that ground truth on what we're trying to do here and why, I find if you have clarity there, then the road mapping is like 10 times easier. And if you don't have clarity there, then the road mapping becomes this very painful process. So, but let me know in the comments below what you all think about road mapping, if you have questions or if you want to share advice for other PMs. And thanks in advance to everybody who's listening to this live, but also on replay. If you've liked and shared, that's awesome. And I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.